Hi, Quentin, and hi, David. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour and a pleasure to come and talk to you today about this topic, because it's something I am very passionate about. David, I think the actual formal term is over the hill GL, but it is great to be able to re-engage with the YGL community and talk about this particular topic. And in fact, one of the things we have been doing on sabbatical is going and doing a bit more research into some of these different business models and looking at how what I think is the upcoming sixth wave of innovation is starting to unfold, and I'll get into that in a little bit in just a second. Just to give another piece of introduction, one of my actual academic background and where a lot of this work comes from is I was originally an engineer, but my actual PhD thesis was in a wonderful area of research called innovation theory. And one of the things that I did as I was starting to engage in this innovation theory stuff is look at the linkage between innovation and sustainability. And so what I'm going to take you through over the next, say, half hour is actually going to be looking at the whole circular economy, the whole sustainability domain through what you might call an innovation lens, what role does technological as well as market-based and societal change start to play in terms of the circular economy. But one of the first things that we do in innovation theory, actually, and probably the place that I'll start, is the fact that time frames are particularly important. And if this thing is going to let me go to the next slide. No. There we go. I'm going to start actually with a little bit of an exercise just to warm everyone up. Time frames are important. In some ways, when things occur is just as important as what occurs, and that's one of the first things we learn in the innovation space, that the temporal factors are particularly important, are particularly key. And to give you an example of this, let's imagine it's 100 years ago. It's 100 years ago, and I give everybody $1,000. So I give you all $1,000, but I give it to you on one condition: that you either invest in a company that makes horses or a company that makes cars. Where would you invest your $1,000 100 years ago? Now, there may, and normally when I ask this here, I get a combination of horses and cars. Well, let's look at those two particular technologies side by side in terms of making our decision where we would invest $1,000. Let's start with the horse. It's a pretty good technology. It's been around for a while. You're very familiar with the horse. You grew up with the horse. It's got a great user interface. It's cross-country. It's got that wonderful autopilot feature. If you've had one too many drinks, it can probably take you home. It's very reliable. It generally starts every day, except for the day when it doesn't, and then at least it's probably not going to start again. But on that note, it's actually biodegradable. It runs off biofuels, which you can often grow in your back paddock. It's affordable and it's widely available. It's a pretty good technology, the horse. Right? Let's compare that with the car 100 years ago. It's smelly. It's unreliable. It generally doesn't start on a cold morning. It's unfamiliar. You have to learn a whole new user interface. Not that widely available. It's generally more expensive than a horse. It's got some other drawbacks. For example, it runs off this stuff called petrol, which you have to buy from inconvenient locations that you otherwise necessarily wouldn't have wanted to buy. It's not cross-country. And moreover, there's actually a battle going on between the car lobby and the horse lobby. And the horse lobby, who's the dominant lobby at the time, is actually setting up impediments, barriers, you might call institutional barriers, to the car lobby. There's things like the need for a license, a driver's license. There's a road rule in Arizona. This is true. 100 years ago, a road rule in Arizona which said if you are driving in a car and you see somebody riding a horse, you must pull over to the side of the road and turn that car off, even though it's quite hard to start again. You have to turn the car off until the person on the horse has gone completely past you so that you don't frighten the horse. Right? So if you look at those two technologies side by side at that particular period in time, you'd ask the question, why would you necessarily invest in a car that makes cars over a car that makes horses? Now, of course, the answer to that question is, because of course you would have done much better if you invested in General Motors and say General Horse Car, of course, in hindsight. But the answer to that question is because what I just did then is I looked at things in a very narrow time frame. I looked at those two particular technologies at a point in time, whereas if you look at a much broader time frame and we call this the technology trajectory. The technology trajectory of the horse is taking years to get where the horse is going to get in terms of, its utility and what it could do. And apart from that period when we domesticated them, there was quite a bit of a leap. The technology wasn't going to go much further. Whereas the car, its technology trajectory was very, very steep. And so, and even
Hi, James. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm afraid we seem to have lost your audio connection. I don't know if you're able to dial in again. Yeah, we seem to have lost James on the audio. So hopefully you'll be able to rejoin in a second. Sorry about this, everyone. I'm trying to get James back on the line.
Hi, everybody. It's James here. It must be my Chinese mobile failed on me. So where I was, I hope, before I dropped out, was talking about the fact that timeframes matter, and that effectively the choices you make are often quite different depending on whether you look at things within the current frame or whether you actually understand the full technology trajectory of what's going on. And of course, you can see similar parallels, hopefully, between, say, the internal combustion engine and electric vehicles, and we'll look at a few of those in a second. But this notion then that timeframes matter actually leads me to, I guess, the central piece of theory in which we started to build the work that we did, and that's this notion, and some of you may have come across this before, of what they call waves of innovation. Sometimes known as long waves or Kondratiev waves, after the name of the guy called Nicholas Kondratiev, who first put them forward. He was a Russian economist. And basically, what we've found is when we look into things like the number of patents being filed, the number of new companies being formed, and a few other factors, and I'll get to that in a second, what we've found is since the Industrial Revolution, there hasn't just been one Industrial Revolution. There's been actually successive, say, industrial revolutions, these successive waves of innovation, and you can see them on the slide, hopefully, in front of you. They started with water, so effectively milling, moving on to the railways, then electrification. The fourth wave of innovation was mass production. The automobile is the sort of, the key icon for that one. And then the final one, the one that we've just all lived through, you might say, it was information and communications technology. And what happens with these waves is that they start and there's a lot of disruption. A lot of change and a lot of companies being formed and so on. Towards the middle of a wave, what you get is dominant designs, as they're often called, emerge. So this could be AC Power or Microsoft Windows. And then towards the end of a wave, you get a global depression. And the next slide that I've just put through, hopefully you'll see, is a little bit of work that was done by Allianz. And this was done just after, I think, 2009, 2010. And actually the interesting thing is these waves of innovation, not just about new technologies and new technology platforms, but they're actually very deeply tied into things like the global economy. You can see here, this is the rolling 10-year yield on the Standard & Poor's 500 index. And they found a proxy for it from 1814 until 2009. And what I find there, of course, the first wave of innovation, we didn't have something like S&P 500 index we could even use. But basically, I find very striking, particularly those last two, the fourth and the fifth Kondratiev waves there. And I guess the book is basically about two premises, you might say, two bold predictions. The first being that perhaps we are actually seeing the transition from the fifth wave of innovation to the sixth, because indeed history suggests that if we are seeing that transition from the fifth wave to the sixth, then now is a period when we'll see a lot of, well, first of all, disruption and a lot of significant global change, but also it's a time for a huge amount of opportunity. And it's these inflection points is when a lot of business models start to become unlocked. It's very hard often when things are particularly successful. There's a saying in innovation theory that the greatest inhibitor to innovation is success. When you're particularly successful and things are going particularly well, that's the time when it's very hard to change, because everybody doesn't really necessarily want to change their business model or kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Yet it's these times of disruption, these times of change, when a huge amount of opportunity can be unlocked. So the first half of, I guess, what we were looking at was whether, and I don't have time to go into some of the details for why we think this is a transition from the fifth to the sixth, but indeed we put the bold prediction that the GFC, the global financial crisis, indeed was or is the transition between the fifth wave of innovation and the sixth wave of innovation. But the second half then is, what would the sixth wave of innovation actually look like? What would be the thing that could change and fuel change in the global economy, and in terms of society, in terms of technology, for the next 35 to 40 years, because that's how long these waves of innovation generally tend to last. They're also speeding up. Now, I'll answer that in just a second, what we came up with. But before I do that, as I mentioned, time frames matter, and it's actually important to try to pick the eyes out of what happens during these waves of innovation, and to give you all a bit of an insight into what actually goes on and what causes a wave of innovation. Let's take a moment and look back to that fifth wave of innovation, the information technology wave. And what was it that caused so much change? The fact that, in the 1970s, no one had a computer on their desk. These days, we're all using a computer or a mobile phone or something to probably connect with this. What actually caused that to happen? Well, one of the things that we see in innovation is generally technological change is the result of changing in one of these three areas. Either you can see on the screen, either you get a change in technology. So somebody creates a technology that didn't exist before, say the mobile phone. At the top there, you get change in a market. So suddenly people want to, say, send SMSs rather than make phone calls. They want to have asynchronous communication rather than synchronous communication. The technology is exactly the same, but the market starts to shift. Or, and actually this is where most technological change actually occurs, it's actually changes in what we call institutions. That's the stuff that's called, that you might say, is the glue of society. It's the stuff, so it's firm structure, it's rules and regulations, it's culture. It's the things which allow technology to make it to market, and the things which allow markets to send back messages around which technologies are successful or not. And the interesting thing about innovation is that's the only way you do get technological change is a change in one of those three areas, either a new technology, a new market, or new shifting markets, or some sort of shift in institution which allows existing technologies to get to existing markets in a different way. Now that's normal innovation. What happens in these waves of innovation is you actually get massive changes in all three simultaneously, to the extent that they reinforce one another. So if we dissect what happened in the last 30 or so years for information and communications technology, the technology side is pretty obvious, and most of you will have heard of this thing called Moore's Law. Moore's Law was first put forward by Gordon Moore, and he put out a bold prediction in the 70s that the number of microprocessors that we could fit on a transistor, number of transistors we can fit on a microprocessor, will double every 18 months for the same price. In other words, the price-performance ratio for a microchip will double every 18 months. Now, if you think about it, that's a pretty bold prediction, because we've never had any technology that's ever done that, particularly not for 30 or 40 years before. And there's an old joke which gives an example of that. Bill Gates and Henry Ford Jr. were having a chat, and Henry Ford Jr. says, Bill, Bill said to Henry Ford Jr., he said, Henry, if you made cars like we made computers, in other words, doubling its price-performance ratio every 18 months, right? If you made cars like we made computers, by now you'd be able to buy a car for $5, stick in a thimble full of petrol, and drive it to the moon and back. Henry Ford Jr. said, yeah, Bill, but it wouldn't crash every 5 minutes. Anyway, sorry to anybody from Microsoft, but the joke there is basically that if we have never seen a technology that was actually able to do that before. And that was the technological change, the shift, and it wasn't just about microprocessors, it was also about how many bits you could stick down a pipe, a piece of copper wire, or eventually optic fiber. But that was the technological change that was going on. And interestingly, when we think about information technology, it's often that comes into people's minds as that was where everything was changing. But actually, the institutional changes were just as profound. What was happening to society? Well, the thing that was happening to society was that we were actually becoming a lot more networked than ever before. And this is a thing called Metcalfe's law. And Metcalfe's law talks about the number, basically the utility of a network increases with the number of connections to the network. So in other words, the more people have a mobile phone, the more useful a mobile phone becomes. Or the more people have a phone, the more useful a phone becomes. Or the more people who are joined to Facebook, the more useful Facebook becomes, and so on. And interestingly, Metcalfe's law also talks about the fact that eventually there becomes a cost for not being in the network. What happens if I don't have a website? What happens if I don't have an email address? What happens if I don't have a Facebook account? Will I not be invited to good parties? And interestingly, what we found is that basically a whole lot of things, whether it's B2B, B2C, all these things were starting to get more networked. And that network effect was effectively turbocharging the increased utility, the scale that we were getting from ever cheaper or more effective for the same price microprocessors. And interestingly, again, you might think it was effectively, microprocessors plus the internet, the networking effect. But that doesn't mean that's only 2/3 of the story. Where did the money come from? Where did the money come from that paid for the computer on my desk, that paid for the mobile phone in your pocket, that paid for the servers in some cloud somewhere? Well, the answer to this was actually first put forward by Nicholas Negroponte, and he posited that it was actually all based on transaction cost. And this is a theory that was first created by a guy called Ronald Coase, and he won the Nobel Prize for Economics for identifying the role that transaction costs played in the economy. And what Negroponte, I guess, believed, and I think this is fairly accurate, or showed, I guess should probably say, is that effectively what we did with all these microprocessors and these network effects was we're actually just stripping transaction costs out of the economy. To give you an example of a transaction cost, imagine I needed, at this very point in time, to go and find a paperclip. Now, if I needed to go and find a paperclip, I might have to put you all on hold. I might have to ferret around for 30 seconds somewhere until I found the paperclip. Well, if I multiply that everybody's time on the end of this call times that 30 seconds and ends up being half an hour, we bill ourselves out at $200. There's suddenly a $100 transaction cost for me to go and get a fraction of a cent item. And what Negroponte put forward was that actually the world economy had so many transaction costs involved that it actually and the transaction cost was far in excess of many of the items we were buying. But indeed, what we found is that we then applied information technology to these transaction costs and then made money by reducing them. So if I could go back in time, if I could hop in a time machine and whisper to my little baby ear, my father's ear, and basically say, how do you make money in the fifth wave of innovation? It would be by doing it. So I would take the largest transaction cost I could find and apply information technology to it in a networked environment. And they were generally the rules of thumb for the fifth wave of innovation. If that makes sense. So basically now moving on to what you might call the sixth wave of innovation. And hopefully everybody on the phone, and it's hard to tell because I can't get your feedback, but hopefully everybody understands about these waves of innovation and how they're all about the interplay between networks, markets, technology, and institutions.
Hi, James. Just at that point, could I just interrupt? The connection is a little bit flaky, so could I ask if you could just speak up a little bit? I think that the connection's letting us down a bit. That'd be really helpful.
Certainly. How's that? Is that better, Quentin?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks, James.
Lovely. So that really gets me to then, if indeed the fifth wave of innovation was powered by Moore's law, in other words, doubling of the number of things you get in a microprocessor, turbocharged by networking and then paid for by reducing transaction costs. What we do is we then look at where's something similar going on that could actually be a candidate for the sixth wave of innovation. And indeed, what we found when we started to look around and look at all the different options was the most likely candidate was this thing called resource efficiency. And then indeed that I guess our bold prediction was, well, first of all, that we are in the transition between the one wave of innovation to the next, but the bold prediction was that the sixth wave of innovation would be all about resource efficiency, or another way of looking about it is resource scarcity. Now, why do we think that? Well, because it is the only place where we can see this massive change going on between these three areas, the market factors, the institutional factors, and the technology factors, where they're reinforcing each other. Taking market, for example, and I'm probably preaching to many of the converted in this call, given that it is around the circular economy, but we are seeing almost a perfect storm in market factors, where we have on one side increasing scarcity of resources. Here's one showing ore grades. You could do the same for phosphates or a whole lot of other global resources. And on the other hand, we're also seeing massive increasing demand for resources. Here's a study that the World Economic Forum commissioned, actually, I think it's 2010, where they actually looked at the forecast increase in annual water demand from 2005 to 2030. And this study found, for example, China alone was set to increase its water demand by 61%. The same report found that we are currently consuming around 95% of the reliably available freshwater resource. So on one side we have scarcity, and the other side we have growing demand. And the third side of the perfect storm in the market factors is that actually we have huge amounts of inefficiency in many of our systems. 85% of the energy in your internal combustion engine does not get used moving you forward. 85% of that energy goes into heat or sound. So they're the market factors, this notion of resource scarcity tied with increasing demand. The institutional factors then is a really interesting piece, and it's where we actually, in the jargon, it's sometimes called ecosystem services, it's sometimes called internalizing externalities, but really the big institutional change is simply put as pricing things that have never been priced before. And we're starting to see around a whole range of environmental resources trying to find some way of attaching an economic or some other price to it. And for me, the simple way of thinking about that is, what is the value of a tree? Is the value of a tree the amount of money you can get if you chop the tree down and sell the wood? Or is it the amount of money you get if you chop the tree down and sell the land? Because they're the two ways in which we've been effectively pricing trees so far. Whereas the tree provides all these other services. It purifies water. It creates oxygen from carbon dioxide. It sequesters carbon dioxide. It harvests biodiversity. It's got amenity value. We're starting to find ways, in all of those examples that I just gave, finding ways of attaching an economic value to it. And there was a study done, again, about, I think it was 2009 this time, which found that the actual value of these ecosystem services to the global economy, which in many cases we're pricing in but not directly, value of those was actually around 4 times the value of the global GDP. And so one of the things, as we start to price these things in, we see we can actually start to turbocharge those markets that I just mentioned before. So they're the market factors being resource scarcity, the institutional factors being pricing things we haven't looked before, and the third one being then technology factors. And we're also seeing this spike in investment in technology around sometimes called clean tech, sometimes green tech, a whole lot of different areas. Here's one looking at the spike in the US around Department of Energy R&D spending that came after the GFC. That one actually then cut down. But interestingly, if you then look at the global numbers, and let's see if that's coming through, you can actually see here's renewable energy investments. They've actually continued to grow over 2009, 10, and 11. The developing countries are actually, in some ways, keeping pace. I believe, interestingly, the largest single investment, as I understand it, in renewable energy resources is currently the 863 program in China. So we're actually seeing this massive investment in technology starting to occur around this space. It's not just countries that are investing, such as we've seen a shift in my organisation, CSIRO. We spend about $1.2 billion on research each year. We've seen a shift into this space. But of course, it's companies as well. And here's one that many of you know of course, the GE Imagination Program. GE is a very interesting company because it's one of the few companies that's actually managed to surf multiple waves of innovation. Another good example is IBM. And the way GE has done this, and the reason why companies are often not able to surf these multiple waves, is because it does reinvent itself. And currently it is reinventing itself around this eco-imagination. It's also doing it around a health space, and we could talk about health in the question, because it's the only other candidate as we saw it for the next wave of innovation. I can talk about that if we like. But interestingly, GE has already created $10 billion worth of new business in this eco-imagination space. So hopefully, and I guess I gave the shorthand before, which was resource efficiency. But indeed, if you really want the longhand, what the way of articulating the sixth wave of innovation is that we would be shifting in a world of limited resources. We'd be shifting from an old mode of operation to a new mode of operation. The old mode being where we've been harvesting resources that are plentiful and cheap, to the new mode where we're managing resources that are scarce and valuable. And effectively, and in some ways, and this is where it's absolutely aligned with this whole notion of the circular economy, effectively trying to decouple economic growth from resource consumption. Because if there's one thing that's been true from the very beginning, the first wave of innovations, we have seen economic growth and resource consumption coupled very, very strongly. But indeed, if you want to continue economic growth without consuming, and you start to reach the limits to the resource consumption, of course, you need to start to decouple them. And so the question then became so what are the business models? What are the techniques? What are the ways in which you can see that decoupling occur? What are the ways in which you can actually create opportunity from this shift from that old mode of operation to the new mode of operation? And indeed, this then opens the world to, so what? If indeed we are shifting, if indeed we are seeing this move towards a new wave of innovation, and that indeed some business models can then change, they're being unlocked and so on, what does that mean? And I guess that what we then found is we started to look at companies, and look at a lot of startups, look at a lot of large companies and how they were shifting. And when we started to catalogue what companies that started to take advantage of this notion of resource scarcity or resource efficiency were doing, we found that there was actually 5 ways in which they were succeeding, the way that which they were succeeding in this notion of a resource-limited world. And you might call that the five business models, the 5, we just went simply and said they were the 5 rules of thumb. In the same way that the rule of thumb for the 5th wave of innovation would have been go back, find the largest transaction cost and apply information technology to it in a networked environment. And for the last few minutes, I'm going to just take you through these 5 rules of thumb. The first rule of thumb is probably no surprise. In the same way as the previous wave of innovation would have been find the largest transaction cost you can. In this one, it's find the largest source of waste you can and try to work out what to do with it. And there's a whole lot of companies that are doing things like trying to buy landfills and looking at urban commodification, looking at finding ways of taking feedstock from waste from one process and turning it into feedstock for another. My favourite one is the Canadian beer company called Storm Brewing. It's found a way of taking its grain waste, which could never normally be ingested by animals. They just had to throw it away, but they found that they could actually grow shiitake mushrooms on it. So now they're a beer and shiitake mushroom company. And the shiitake mushrooms changed the waste so they could now sell it as animal feed, so beer, shiitake mushroom, and animal feed. But interestingly, that's the normal way we look at waste, but there's other ways of looking at waste. Look at the room around you if you are indeed sitting in a room. There's a whole lot of waste in that room. What about the waste energy that's being let out from under the doors or through the windows, cracks in the windows? What about the roof? What's happening to the incident heat that's coming on that roof? If you're sitting down in your house and you own a car, what's happening with that car? What's happening to the capital asset? Is it being used to its maximum efficiency? What's going to happen to the seat at the end of its life? Is that seat going to see its full lifespan? And all those areas are different ways in which we're starting to find, and there's different business models trying to tap into those little pieces of waste. That then leads me to the actual second rule of thumb that we identified. And interestingly, it's not quite as obvious, but it's probably even more profound, and it was the sell the service, not the product. Interestingly, if you want to decouple economic growth from resource consumption, on the small scale, what that says is you want to decouple value from resource consumption. The way you decouple value from resource consumption is you turn things into services rather than products. To make that tangible, imagine I'm selling you a washing machine. My incentive, what's your incentive? Your incentive is for that washing machine to last for as long as possible. My incentive is for that washing machine to last probably to the warranty period and just a bit longer, right? Because if it lasts forever, I might not get a chance to sell you another washing machine. So interesting that mismatched incentive is one of the reasons why we don't necessarily see things built to last, to use that vernacular, or necessarily continually being reused. Whereas if suddenly I change the business model, instead of selling you a washing machine, I give you the washing machine, I charge you 10 cents per wash. Suddenly it's in both of our interests. In other words, I'm selling you the service of cleaning clothes, not a washing machine. It's suddenly in both our interests to make that washing machine last as long as possible and potentially clean the clothes with as little resource as possible, particularly if I'm bundling in the water or the detergent and so on. In fact, I might even find a way of doing it without any detergent at all. And so that notion that services, finding what the true service is and a way of decoupling the service from the product being delivered is absolutely now starting to find its way through a whole lot of different business models, such as the collaborative consumption business model, where we're looking at access rather than ownership. That's really talking about the service rather than the product. Car share companies, for example, the service is mobility. It's not about the car. We're finding other business models. My favorite one is around energy. Does anybody actually want a kilowatt hour of energy? No, we want the service that energy provides. We want light and heat and mobility and a place to charge our mobile phone. And there's companies starting to find ways of selling those things independently of the energy. Wokingham Council in the UK. If you live there, you can sign a contract with them not to buy energy, but actually you'll sign a contract for them to keep your house between 23 and 25 degrees Celsius all year round. And then they'll come in and they'll check under your doors and windows, and they'll make sure you've got insulation in the roof, because they want to deliver that service as efficiently as they possibly can. They're selling the service, not the product. That then leads me to the third rule of thumb that we identified, and it's really, interestingly enough, it's a thing that then enables the first two to occur. If you want to turn waste into opportunity, or if you want to sell services rather than products, what you really need to know is to either where the waste is or how those services are being utilized. And both of them then start to point towards the fact that you need that everything in the natural world, you need to start tracking it and monitoring its utilization. And this is this notion of digital and natural convergence. The way of talking about it is basically everything in the natural world one day will start to have a digital counterpart. And so whether it's the glass on the table in front of me, whether it's the building that I'm in, whether it's the light switch on the wall, whether it's me, we all start to have a digital counterpart. The glass has a radio frequency ID tag in it saying I'm a glass. The building has a building management system, which is monitoring the building. The light switch is connected to the smart grid. I already have my own digital version. It's called my mobile phone. It tracks where I am. It knows what I'm doing. Eventually, it's going to be my wallet and my keys. It'll measure my heartbeat, so it knows whether I'm alive. It starts to become my digital version, coupled with things like my Facebook account and so on. And interestingly, we also then start to see that the digital versions start to not just underpin these business models, but actually create business models of its own, such as when the digital world starts to then come back out in the natural world. And I've just got a picture there around this whole space of augmented reality and so on. So that notion that digital and natural convergence becomes a critical area, and a good question for a lot of businesses is, what is the digital version of what we do or we own or we use? Because there's probably businesses in terms of new businesses, in terms of understanding that. This also then leads to an interesting space between, in some ways, where do people start to compete? Because if you start thinking about waste becoming at a premium, but at the same time everything becoming connected and digital, you suddenly realize that there's two business models that start to emerge. And we paraphrase that as bits are global, atoms are local. In other words, if it's anything to do with atoms or physical matter, including electrons and energy, we're starting to see you start to see a shift because the cost of shipping these heavy things around becomes quite expensive. You start to see a shift towards making that as local as possible, local production, small scale 3D printing, all those sorts of business models. But at the same time, you start to see business models opening up around the long tail, the notion that bits are global, and it's where those two things converge, where you can find the resource base becomes extremely local, and again, I'm pointing here to some collaborative consumption business models where they're trying to keep the resources as local as possible, yet tapping into some sort of global platform for the information exchange. That then becomes a very powerful way of creating new business. And turns a lot of existing businesses up on their head, which in some ways we're trying to look for economy of scale in the atom space and keeping some of the information local. So those are the four business models that we really identified, the waste, the services, the digital natural convergence, and bits of global, atoms are local. But interestingly, when we looked at all the companies that were doing this, there was one fifth one that started to stand out. One that was both a catch-all, but also there's some businesses that were just doing only this. And this was in some ways the most profound of the lot. And it was this. It was, if in doubt, look to nature. Because interestingly, all the things that I've just described before, natural processes already do in some ways. So nature runs off sunlight. Nature doesn't do one-way chemical reactions. It always allows two-way chemical reactions. So feedstock from one process, waste from one process can become feedstock for another. Nature consumes resources as locally as possible. Nature's scalable. There's a whole lot of things, if you look at natural systems, which actually reflect the notion of resource efficiency. And what we're starting to find is businesses and technologies that are coming out that actually just mimic, and the whole biomimicry space, or build upon natural systems, whether it's filtration systems that actually work in harmony with nature, to things like there's a new material that they're developing, which is a ship's hull, which is modelled on shark skin, such that if the ship travels faster than 6 knots, all the barnacles fall off. Or shopping centres in Africa, which are modelled on termite mounds, and there's one particular one which is 10 times more efficient and more energy efficient than the next door shopping centre. So this notion that we can find ways of copying natural systems, because those natural systems have had millions of years to find ways of becoming more resource efficient. And in fact, what we start to see is even design. Our design processes even start to copy natural systems, and I remember talking once to somebody who won a TV show in Australia around invention, and all of his inventions all looks like insects or bones. And I said, why do your things look so organic? And he says, well, it's really simple. I just stick in the strengths, the physical characteristics that I want into the machine, and these days we can do injection molding so easily. I just tell it to strip out anything that's not needed to get that strength, and what it ends up looking like is an insect or a bone. And so this notion that natural systems become really important in a way of testing, you might say, some of our ideas in that wave of innovation is critical. So hopefully what I've just done is given you some information around both how technological change can point to some theories around technological change can point to the fact that we are in an inflection point at the moment, that we might be seeing this shift, and then some rules of thumb which we've identified, and just by looking at and I think it was William Gibson who said the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. We've actually seen a lot of these particular technologies and particular business models being implemented already. But I guess I'd leave everybody with just the thought: what does the world look like if you start to run this forward 35 years? Because interestingly, that's for me, that's the real question for the circular economy task force. Can we paint a picture in some ways of what a real circular economy starts to do? And for me, there's some of these rules of thumb start to point towards that. It is a world where we are taking waste and turning it into feedstock, where we actually have eliminated a lot of the waste from the system. It's a world where people do value services over necessarily the product. It's a world where we have seen this digital natural convergence occur. It's a world where we actually are very well connected locally with our local communities, but we are part of that the global market and exchanging information globally. And it's a world which everything looks a lot more organic and starts to look much more natural. So, David, I might leave it at that point and open up to questions. And I hope that's been interesting for everyone.
Excellent, James. Thank you so much. This is really a wonderfully elegant presentation and great way of thinking of how innovation starts and where we are today. With that in mind, are you an optimist in terms of where we are today?
Oh, it's a really hard. Look, I'm by nature I'm a complete optimist, but I've also there is a dark side to all of this. If we wanted to go into that side, which is that. But on the flip side of these waves of innovation is that there is, and particularly for some of them, they are followed by periods of massive disruption. That there's lurches to one side of politics or the other. There's massive delocation. There's a whole lot of issues that get fraught. So on one stage, if I put on my 30 or 40 year hat, just because I guess I see these mega trends coming together around these areas, you might say I'm an optimist, because I think a lot of these problems that we're seeing now will start to get solved. If I put on my short-term hat, I start to fret around the pathways and how much dislocation we're going to see and how quickly we're going to act and indeed for particular economies or particular segments of society, what it will mean for them. So that's the only way I can probably answer it, David.
Okay, and this is in line with a question. There are several questions coming in. Is what has to be true for innovation to then follow a crisis? So, if you're more bearish in the short term, bullish in the long term, how do we turn that corner?
So I think there's a couple of ways of looking at that. One is that there's a body of work that's shown that it doesn't. This was actually the green building piece showed this to be true. It doesn't take 50% of people to do something to cause a real shift in institutions or otherwise. It just takes more than 50% of people to think that one day something, and then suddenly everybody races to become the first or the second to try to get advantage from it. Actually, part of it's giving a vision, part of it's actually going out and creating.
James, you're breaking up a little bit. If you could speak a little louder.
How's that better, David? Sorry.
You're still, there's some latency on the line, but we'll power through.
Okay, I'll try moving. So the first thought is that basically it is about people's expectations. The second thing is really, of those three areas that I mentioned, technology, markets, and institutions, in the long run, it's the institutions that matter more than anything else. And one of the real challenges we have at the moment is global institution making, global governance processes. A lot of them are completely stalled, and it's very hard for technology to find its way to market if the institutions aren't cooperating.
Wow. It's well, to your point of it, it just takes a few to start a revolution. Fortunately, YGLs are revolutionary, so we're talking to the right audience. So to your point, if you mentioned the institution of the three factors that you need to spark this technology change. If institution is a heavier weight of you need to get that piece right, often it's policy that's the most clumsy and it's the laggard of the free markets, being technology and market. So, I mean, what's any thoughts there?
Well, there's actually a saying that I've heard actually first in Europe, and it's that actually companies don't compete, systems compete. And interesting that the point there being that sometimes companies are products of the systems, i.e. people will just move if they don't like the system, or sometimes the system won't allow the company to be born in the first place. So my thoughts there are it is very critical to get the institutional factors right. Sometimes though, of course, it's not the only thing, and I actually find it hard to. The whole point about those three factors is that basically it's all three. It's business, it's government, it's science and technology, which all have a role to play, and finger pointing and so on doesn't actually help. But it's actually getting the sweet spot, getting the places where those three areas cooperate is the key for a system to be able to compete more effectively.
Mm-hmm. So if the three need to work together, if the institutional factor is possibly more important, is there when you look at patterns of these waves of innovation, is there a more effective genesis where you like to see a pattern of either policy or institution started off, or do you see where the market is the genesis of the innovation that leads to a faster adoption rate or technology revolution or wave revolution?
It's a good question, because normally it's almost like handing the baton, and it's very hard to really understand it. So you look at telecommunications, for example, in the ICT space, and it started off with the technology that didn't ever exist before. Then the market started to take the lead in terms of technology. Then the institutional factors held it back. In many cases, until there was big deregulation of the telecoms industries in a lot of places, and monopolies were broken up. And then it was handed back to technology to take the next step. So the difficult bit is, which one takes first? In the sixth wave space, for me, the one that is lacking is the institutional area. And as I mentioned, the big institutional shift that we saw happening in certain areas, and I guess the global carbon debate is the poster child of failure in terms of trying to get a global agreement going on. But that whole notion of internalizing externalities, in terms of, we are paying for a lot of the impacts of waste at the moment. We are paying for the sustenance of our ecosystem services, but we're actually doing it indirectly. We're doing it through things like tax, higher taxes around, disasters. We just had one in Australia following a big flood in Brisbane. We're doing it through higher insurance premiums. We're doing it through, seeing higher inequality as a result of environmental stress. So we actually are paying for a lot of these things, and really what that notion of institutional change is basically sheeting home those costs to where they actually originated. And that's the one that I think is probably the least effective at the moment of the three.
Mm-hmm. Well, as someone living in the United States, it's certainly least effective in our country, unfortunately. And here you're talking to YGLs where business leaders, policy leaders, NGOs, whether it's on this part of institution or something else. I mean, what can we do? What should we be doing better?
So for me, the first answer would actually be, and there's some very simple questions you can ask yourself, which aligned with these things. We found it quite effective to ask these questions. It is, and they are very simple questions, such as, where is there waste in our system? Whether your system is a country or a company, where are we experiencing waste? What is the service that we really provide? I asked that question to quite a few companies. generally, and it's amazing what happens when you really dig into it. A company which thought it did roadside assistance realized that it was actually selling the service of reliability, and the moment it did that, it realized, and it actually had a huge business in a whole lot of other areas. That what is the digital version of what we do? Where are we global, where are we local, and what is the closest thing in nature to part of our systems? Asking those 5 questions and starting to find real answers for them is a big shift. In terms of then the meta, is what could we do as YGLs as a bigger community? For me, the most profound thing, I guess, around all this thinking that I've been doing in the innovation space is that we are potentially seeing a big shift, right? And that Einstein thing of the problems, the mindset, used that created the problems is not the same mindset that can solve them. But the opportunity, if we are experiencing a shift from one wave of innovation to the next, is that we do have the opportunity to change that mindset. And that actually, we've all grown up, or at least I've grown up in a period within basically one wave of innovation. Everything's been fairly steady. Like a lot of the brands that I've seen at the beginning of the wave are still here and so on. We haven't necessarily witnessed what a shift looks like. But if we can actually say, hang on, we are in a shift, that basically this is a time for us to make change, if we can actually say that this is the period of changing business models, of opening up opportunity, that's a pretty compelling message, that's a powerful message. It's not going to be business as usual. So what are we going to do about it?
Excellent. It's certainly hard to change behavior, but illustrating it that way should get people moving faster. So it's a lot of asking these 5 business models, internalizing them as an NGO policymaker, business leader, and how it applies to us. Could you elaborate more on the digital and natural convergence? Maybe give a little example. That one seems maybe less obvious as the other ones.
Sure. Let me take one, for example. So this is the first one that just leapt to my mind. It's not actually necessarily linked with resource efficiency, interestingly enough, but it's linked to the fact that it's the flip side of where business opportunities start to come out around the resource efficiency. And there's a company who realized that they sold asthma puffers, right? And normally everybody uses an asthma puffer, and they get a lovely service out of that asthma puffer, which is relief from asthma.
I'm sorry, what do they sell?
Asthma puffers.
Oh, asthma. Okay.
Asthma puffer, right? And this company realized, hang on, there's another service we could provide, which is if we put a GPS receiver on an asthma puffer. In other words, we start to give that asthma puffer a digital version. We will, and we can start tracking where people are inhaling. And interestingly enough, that data becomes much more valuable in some ways than actually the relief in the long term. It becomes more valuable than the relief from the asthma. And this company has found that the data they're collecting is starting to tell their clients a lot about their natural environment. It's telling them where they get asthma attacks. They're able to, some people can voluntarily submit the de-identified, the anonymous data to the company for sharing with the health officials in the jurisdiction. I.e., they can start to find buildings which are causing susceptibility to asthma. That notion of the digital version, what is the digital version of the asthma puffer, right, starts creating a lot more value for that company. And now, because it stores all this information, personal information about a person, people continually go back to that company for their puffer. So hopefully, David, that's a bit of an example of just where, one example where you could take an offline thing, a thing in the natural world, give it a digital version, and that creates a huge lot of opportunity. But the thing about the 6th wave is that those other business models really predict that everything that you can possibly imagine, whether it's starts to get a digital, there becomes a value for putting some sort of digital information around it, because it will help us either reduce waste or it'll be involved in the service that we're selling.
Okay, excellent. And we'll end off on, here's another question from the group. If you had to think of a modern day equivalent of the horse and car, where we are today, what would it be, and are we about to go down the wrong road with any present technologies?
It's a really interesting one. The obvious one is the internal combustion engine versus the electric vehicle, because that's a clear space where electric engines can completely outperform petrol engines. Their technology trajectory is much better, and it's all predicated on the technology trajectories of battery technologies and so on. I guess I'm trying to think of some less obvious ones. I think things like some of the different energy technologies that we're looking at. I think we're going, the one, for example, solar, some of the renewable energy technology trajectories in the long run. Again, they've got a lot more opportunity, but they will be distorted. Well, they are being distorted. They're being distorted at the moment by institutional factors such as the huge amount of subsidy that goes on globally for non-renewable resources. That was some work that the IEA did recently, which showed, and I don't have the number off the top of my tongue, but it was astronomical compared to the amount of money we're spending on renewable energy research. But also is going to be the shale oil, the fracking space. I think will distort that. Those two trajectories will that whole market will change as well. And I think that's an interesting space as well. The fracking space will probably give us a bit more time in terms of the carbon dioxide area, but in the long term, it may also delay some natural rebalancing in terms of the energy mix as well. So that notion of looking at those trajectories, trying to understand where they might end up, and what's the 30-year bet is probably the energy space and the mobility space are two critical ones, I'd say.
Excellent. Well, we'll leave it there, James. YGL, thank you for sending in the questions. Great questions. James, well-deserved acclaim for the book. This is really brilliant. It really sums up where we are very well and paints a clear picture, and as well as a way for people to understand and, as you said, internalize where to go next through these 5 business models. So I've taken lots of notes, and certainly this has broadened my mind as well as a lot of ours. So thank you so much for taking the time here with us today.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for your time. It's great to talk.